Hello, everyone. My name is Alex. I'm the chair of this session, and this is part of work we're doing with Survey Features, which is a large grant in the UK where we're looking at data quality and the future of surveys. And this is part of a work package where we're looking at data integration. It's my great pleasure to have today two speakers. We'll have Tom, who's part of this work package, and Tom will give an overview of data linkage and how different types of linked data can be used to deal with non-response. We also have Joe, who will present some applications and showing us how we can use in practice linked data to look at non-response. And then we'll have Pierre, who will talk about different types of data that are available to do this kind of work. So the plan is to have some presentation around 20-25 minutes. We'll have some short clarification questions after each talk, and then at the end, we'll have some more time for Q&A. So with that, Tom, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alex. Great. So hi everyone. My name is Thomas O'Toole. I'm a postdoc at the University of Manchester. Today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about some of the work we've been doing on the Survey Futures project, specifically on Research Strand 7, which is all about data integration. And before I go any further, a huge thank you to Alex, who's the Research Strand lead, and also to Natalie, Nikos, and Joe, who've been a joy to work with throughout this project. So I guess let's start at the start. What is data integration? So we're referring to the process of bringing together information from multiple data sources in a coherent and consistent manner. The point being to make it possible to examine relationships between factors that might not be visible from any one data source alone. And this research strand is explicitly concerned with why and how non-survey data can be used to enhance survey data. We have three different work strands. We have one on the options available to researchers and practitioners who are working with integrated survey and non-survey data. The guide for this is already available, and I'll link to that in a second. We have one looking at evaluating and compensating for non-response bias, which should be available before the end of the year, and that's what I'll be covering today. We also have applications for monitoring and intervening in data collection. So kind of targeted responsive adaptive designs, which is currently in the works. So keep your eyes peeled for that about the middle of next year. So I'm going to quickly recap some of the foundations that we covered in the first workshop we held. This is a QR code for the full kind of practice guide. If that's of interest, there's quite a snappy executive summary there, which should hopefully be useful, but I'll cover some of that now. So to start off with, we conducted evidence and literature reviews, and we found a variety of non-survey data types which are commonly linked to survey data for a variety of reasons. The full guide covers those reasons in a bit more detail, but we kind of broadly classify this data into three types. So we've got admin data, which is usually collected for routine and operational purposes. For example, hospital records, educational attainment data, tax records, and that's often linked at the individual level. There's geospatial data, which is often collected through satellite imagery or sensors. And geospatial data often comes in the form of kind of permission to link data at a selected spatial scale. So, for example, government office region, LSOA, kilometre by kilometre grid, but also at the respondent unit, kind of the individual level. And there's also digital trace data, which is derived from interactions with digital platforms. And this is quite good at tracking behaviors and trends. So, for example, web scraping, smart tracking apps, document scanning, and donated data. Digital trace data is often linked at the individual level and is usually collected or donated by existing survey respondents. So that's different to, say, admin data, which is often generated independently and then linked. A quick recap as well on how records are linked. So records can be linked exactly or deterministically, especially if there's a good unique matching field, something like national insurance number, NINO. More commonly, records are linked on a series of non-unique identifiers. So, for example, name, address, sex, date of birth. Fuzzy matching refers to allowing for some errors in the deterministic matching process. So, using maybe only the first three letters of a name or a string. But deterministic matching might result in a higher rate of false negatives or missed matches, given they need to be exact to be counted. When deterministic matching isn't feasible, we can use probabilistic matching techniques, which model the probability of a correct match. This is often used for kind of fringe cases that can't be linked deterministically, but this can lead to a higher rate of false positives or linked matches incorrect linkages. So how can you access integrated data? This is written from the perspective of academia, really. But survey agencies and other bodies will have their own procedures and safe havens, trusted research environments. But to access this, what can be quite disclosive data, you'll need relevant accreditation, and your outputs will need to adhere to quite strict disclosure requirements. And today we're lucky enough to be hosted by the UK Data Service, and we'll be hearing more about their data catalog later in the session. So, onto the topic of today's presentation, which is using integrated data to evaluate and to compensate for non-response bias. I'll cover what non-response bias is, some methods for evaluating and compensating for non-response bias, and then also some useful data sources, and then I'll end with some recommendations and a quick summary. So, over the past decade, the landscape of survey data has changed quite substantially. Response rates in probability-based surveys have seen quite a steady decline, with a particularly sharp drop-off in the wake of COVID-19. But a low response rate doesn't necessarily indicate poor survey quality. The measurement of survey non-response can be a useful tool when it's used in addition to indicators of sample representativeness and sample composition. In cross-sectional surveys, unit or individual level non-response comes from a failure to successfully recruit a unit of interest. This could be for a variety of reasons. So maybe they can't be contacted. If they are contacted, maybe they refuse to participate. And if they do participate, maybe they don't provide sufficient information for their responses to be counted as valid. In longitudinal and panel surveys, non-response can also occur when units from the previous sweep of data collection can't then be observed in the next sweep. And this typically stems from survey attrition, as kind of people who are initially willing to take part drop out over time. And in longitudinal surveys, unit of response often accumulates at each wave of data collection. The implication here is that only a subset of the target population is ever really measured, and that those who are sampled might not represent who they're supposed to. So, for example, respondents who are too ill to participate in a study might lead to more positively biased health estimates because the sample will just be healthier. People who are in full-time employment might not be around in the middle of the day. It's for like a doorstep interview, and might be more difficult to reach. So estimates of employment might be biased downwards. But non-response is the property of a survey, whereas non-response bias is a property of a statistic. The probability of non-response is thought to be conditional on a number of separate causes, so individual factors like health and employment, and also common causes like socioeconomic position, and survey causes like length and topic. So non-response bias occurs when all of these causes result in a sample which is systematically different to the target population, or when there is a relationship between the response propensity and the survey variable of interest. Missing data, in general, can be classified according to three mechanisms, which influence both their potential impact on estimates and also the methods that we can use to compensate for them. So first we have missing completely at random, which is when the probability of the probability of missing data is independent of any observed or unobserved data. So we have no kind of information on it. For example, you might see kind of paper surveys lost in the post, that kind of thing. This, in theory, would be quite strongly representative given its nature, but can't ever really be established in practice. Next up, we have missing at random. This is when the probability of missing data is related to the observed data. So, for example, people who live in certain regions might be less likely to respond to a survey, for example, in London. But we have location available, for example, through the sampling frame. So we have information which is informative of that missingness. Then we have missing not at random, which is when the probability of missing data is related to unobserved data. So an example here might be older people might be less likely to respond to a web survey, and we don't have any information on age in the sampling frame. So I guess this is really the take-home point of this talk. So through the integration of survey and non-survey data, we can link additional explanatory variables with survey data and bring previously unobserved variables into observation. So when data is missing at random and related to variables observable to us, we can kind of model that and account for it in our evaluation and our compensation strategies. Some commonly used approaches to evaluate sample composition are a comparison to population totals. This is usually at the aggregate level, and often uses kind of census data or admin data to highlight discrepancies between sources. That might indicate issues like coverage error and non-response bias. You can also compare subgroup values in a similar way, but again, this relies on having valid population level data to integrate and to compare against, and we'll touch on data sources later. It's also possible to use kind of difference methods to kind of quantify the dissimilarity between the survey and the benchmark, but again, I won't cover that today. These approaches involve a comparison of response rates and kind of sample composition, but as I mentioned, don't necessarily inform us about bias itself. So to examine the bias of a survey variable, we can use R indicators or representativity indicators, which are a measure of the standard deviation of response propensities, often in relation to a known benchmark. So an R indicator value close to 1 suggests kind of a high representativeness, while values close to 0 represent potential non-response bias. R indicators can be used for cross-sectional data, or for the first wave of, say, a longitudinal study if we have information about non-respondents, and can be particularly useful for longitudinal data due to the richness of previous wave survey data. R indicators can also be extended with distance measures to tell us how far the sample is from the benchmark. And there's a great ONS methods paper on this that I'll link to in the chat later. Coefficients of variation are kind of similar, but I've included the formulas here to try and illustrate the differences. Coefficients of variation measure the standard deviation of response propensities relative to the mean. It's kind of a measure of the relative variability of the sample. And this is expressed as a ratio of the standard deviation of the response propensities to the mean response propensity. You'll usually see these as a percentage, with higher values indicating more variability. Unlike R indicators, coefficients of variation are useful for comparison across survey items and across datasets. To kind of effectively evaluate non-response bias, we should really be using ideally a minimum or all four of these together to inform on different parts of response and non-response bias. And the full guide, which is forthcoming, does cover a few more indicators of non-response, like follow-up surveys for non-respondents and methods like fraction of missing information, that kind of thing. So if you are interested, please see the full document when it's out for a more comprehensive list. So if we do detect biases in the sample, we can address them through kind of post-survey adjustments. For example, inverse probability weighting, which is a technique designed to adjust for non-response by modeling the probability of participation. So through something like logistic regression, with response as an outcome and a set of informative variables as predictors, and then applying the inverse of those likelihoods as unit level weights. We have post stratification too, which consists of comparing survey stats to external benchmarks and then creating survey weights so that the weighted sample aligns with those known population distributions. And this can be applied across aggregate level subgroups. Raking or iterative proportional fitting is similar, but the difference here is that we have kind of repeated adjustments of weights to match population totals over a number of different strata, so age, sex, geographical region, and raking also only requires aggregate population totals, but can yield quite high within household heterogeneity, as raking just adjusts weights at the individual level, which is where calibration comes in. Which follows a similar kind of iterative approach, but constrains weights to be equal within households. The difference here, the assumption here is that for calibration is that non-response is a household level decision, and is often determined on the doorstep of like a face-to-face interview. And it's that kind of household level non-response that introduces the most bias between the target population and the survey sample. In survey research, weighting procedures are more commonly used for unit level non-response, with each subgroup of interest usually needing quite like bespoke survey weights. But these procedures can become quite cumbersome, especially with like kind of longitudinal survey data. Each cross-section of longitudinal data might be weighted against population totals or adjusted to non-response, and later waves might be reweighted against earlier waves. It gets quite complicated quite quickly. And so imputation procedures offer an alternative option. And this involves replacing missing data with substituted values from auxiliary data sources, which basically allows for complete case analysis. So in the context of data integration, imputation methods can help with unit level non-response, but are more frequently used to address item level non-response. And there are two main categories here, single imputation and multiple imputation. So single imputation fills in missing values with a single estimate, something like a mean or median. You can also use regression modeling to predict what these missing values might be based on auxiliary variables. There's also nearest neighbor approaches, which assigns missing values based on the kind of closest observed data point in terms of similarity on a kind of a set of relevant variables. And there's hot deck imputation, which substitutes missing values with observed responses from a random similar unit within the dataset. And these can be quite straightforward, but single imputation methods can underestimate variability and might introduce bias if the imputation model is misspecified. So, for example, regression imputation assumes a linear relationship between variables, and that might not hold in all cases. Just that kind of thing. So multiple imputation addresses some of these limitations by creating multiple complete data sets, each with different imputed values, which reflects the kind of uncertainty around missing data. Analyses are conducted on each of these data sets, and then the results are combined to produce estimates that account for both within and between imputation variability. So, for example, we have multiple imputation by chain equations, or MICE, which uses repeated regression modeling to impute values based on the appropriate distribution for the missing value. And we also have predicted mean matching, which instead of drawing from that kind of random distribution, draws missing data or unobserved values to replace missing data from a donor which has a similar predicted mean. And the choice here depends on a few different things, but it's kind of a case by case basis. Some considerations though about these approaches. So these methods all assume missing at random. And so data integration can help to improve the estimation and efficiency of all of these approaches, really. Applying non-response weights to survey data can adjust for bias quite well, bias due to differential response rates, but can also impact the standard error of estimates. So weighting introduces variability, right? And then when weights differ substantially amongst respondents, that can inflate the variance of survey estimates and lead to larger standard errors. This kind of modeling can also be quite computationally intensive. If anybody's ever run multiple imputation by chain equations, you'll know it takes quite a while and makes you lots of think very hard while it's going. So that's something to consider. And also an important note here is with imputed data is not to treat it necessarily like real data. It's an appropriate and sometimes convenient methodology for dealing with missing data, but you should always use diagnostic and sensitivity analysis with the original data source, just to make sure that you're not kind of jumping to conclusions, basically. So we touched on some data types earlier, but I just wanted to cover them again in the context of non-response. So we have non-survey data, which is usually linked at the individual or area level. There's a census, which is often used, in particular the mid-year estimates. These are commonly used as kind of gold standard benchmark data for a lot of the methods we've discussed. For admin data, we've got health and education and employment records, and these have all been used to integrate more kind of observed data with the survey sample to improve the estimation of weights and imputation modeling. And then we have geospatial data. This oftentimes does also come from the census, but also from places like the postcode address file, which is useful for integrating contextual geographical information and for stratification approaches, which aim to kind of spatially rebalance the sample. So if people from a certain area are over or underrepresented, geographical information can help to rebalance that. There are also some more unique data sources which can be used and are frequently used in the non-response process. So we have sampling frame data. In most UK surveys, this comes from the postcode address file, which contains just postcode information on respondents and non-respondents, the entire sampling frame, but doesn't really contain much else. We also have survey paradata, which is data about the survey process. So interview observations, In particular, contact data, so whether or not interviews were kind of refused at the door, is also available for both respondents and non-respondents, and the two together are quite useful. And then we also have previous wave surveys. This obviously really just applies to longitudinal surveys. But previous response patterns are often the strongest predictors of future non-response, which again makes sense. And I'll end up with some recommendations. So response rate should always be used alongside other indicators to inform on sample composition and non-response bias. When considering which indicators to use, it's worth considering two sets: a generic set, so things like sociodemographics, age, location, to facilitate comparison across different surveys, and also a survey-specific set. So some of the kind of paradata, sampling frame data I've discussed would work well here to allow for comparison within the same survey across time and across different designs that might be implemented. It's also advisable to start with a small set of well-measured variables for these approaches, trimming extreme weights, monitoring model convergence, and really the most important thing here is to document it all thoroughly and to make sure that your data and your methods are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. Um, that's quite an important part of this. And of course, each case is unique. And while it's not necessarily a tutorial, the Centre for Longitudinal Studies provides a really useful overview of some practical steps they've taken for imputation and weighting in the CLS cohort studies. And I'll share some links in the chat afterwards for that. And that's everything really. So we've covered non-response bias, what it is, some methods for evaluating and compensating for non-response bias, some additional data sources for handling non-response bias, and we've wrapped up with some recommendations. And yeah, that's everything. I'll hand back over to Alex. Thank you all so much for your time.
Great. Thank you so much. So any quick questions for Tom before we move to the next talk? Any clarification questions?
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so I'll be presenting a case study from Germany where we used linked administrative data to adjust for non-response bias in a so-called piggyback longitudinal study. And throughout this talk, I'll be touching on some of the points that Tom already mentioned, particularly considerations for dealing with non-response bias and how we could potentially use linked administrative data to reduce bias in longitudinal studies. So just as background, we know that unit non-response is a key component of the total survey error framework. And especially in panel surveys, the analytic value of panel survey data grows over time, but cumulative attrition can threaten the representativeness of these data. And there have been several auxiliary data sources that have been used to adjust for attrition bias in longitudinal studies, but they have well-known limitations, particularly with pair data and prior wave survey data, which I'll touch on in a moment. So the proposal of our study was to use administrative data in piggyback panel designs. And what I mean by piggyback panel designs is where respondents from a preceding cross-sectional survey are recruited for a subsequent longitudinal study. And I mention a few examples of piggyback panel surveys that have been conducted before in the US. There was a medical expenditure panel survey household component that was subsampled from participants of a previous US National Health Interview Survey. Also, the English Longitudinal Study of Aging recruits their participants from the Health Surveys for England. And here in Germany, the GASES panel samples respondents from the German General Social Survey. So we know that in longitudinal surveys that cumulative attrition compounds over time, and it's particularly and it increases significantly in the early waves, and this can be influenced by location of the sampled members, contact and cooperation barriers, as well as life events that occur before the interview is attempted. And I previously mentioned that there's limitations of traditional auxiliary data sources. With paradata, you tend to have weak correlations with the substantive survey variables. With commercial data, the data might be outdated, or the quality of those data might be questionable. And even with previous wave survey data, you might still miss events, life events that happen in between waves that could affect people's likelihood of participating in the next interview wave. For example, somebody who might lose their job in between waves, that this could affect their likelihood of participating in subsequent waves. And the survey organization wouldn't know why that person didn't participate, because they wouldn't have any information about that person and what happened to prevent them from participating in the next wave. So this is where we bring in linked administrative data, which overcomes some of these limitations. Linked administrative data can be longitudinal. It can contain substantive survey variables and also capture these between wave events that could affect the likelihood of participation. However, getting access to these administrative data is not always straightforward, and in many jurisdictions, respondent consent is required to use these administrative data. And there have been only a few studies that have investigated the effects of between wave events on attrition, and so we build on that sparse literature. The key questions that we attempted to address in this study was, first, do administrative variables correlate with response outcomes as well as the substantive survey variables? To be good, to be effective in reducing non-response or attrition bias, it's important that the auxiliary variables are correlated with both of these outcomes. Also, does the inclusion of these administrative variables in attrition models improve model fit? And also, does the inclusion of these administrative variables in an enhanced weighting scheme reduce attrition bias compared to a standard weighting scheme? So these are the essential research questions that we tried to address. The survey that we focus on is called the National Educational Panel Study. And this panel study, it's a multi-cohort panel study that focuses on education and employment outcomes in Germany. Here we focus on a particular cohort, the adult cohorts. There are other adolescent cohorts that we don't look at in this particular study. We focus on adults, and these adults participated in the NEPS survey starting in 2009. The survey continues to this day, but we only analyze the first 8 waves of the study until 2017, and it's a mixed mode study, telephone and face-to-face. The NEPS sample is recruited from a prior cross-sectional survey called the Working and Learning in a Changing World, or abbreviated in German by ALVA. And this was a one-off kind of forerunner to the NEPS survey. And this was based on a probability sample drawn from selected municipality records in Germany. And in this forerunner survey, in the ALVA study, the respondents they were asked for consent for data linkage. They were asked for consent to link their interview data to administrative records, which I'll describe in a moment. And then they were also asked for panel willingness. So this is basically a question that asks if the survey organization is allowed to contact the respondent again and do a follow-up survey. So these were two key consent questions that were administered in the ALVA study, which we utilize in the current study. Here is kind of a flow chart of how the ALVA sample how it started, and then we look at the different stages of selection that occurred, leading to the analytic sample that we use for this study. So the fielded sample consisted of about 22,000 adults, and we can see about 10,000 of them responded. There were some exclusion criteria that were also implemented, including some age restrictions as well as some language restrictions. And for a variety of reasons, these restrictions reduced the analytic sample size. The consent question for the data linkage, the consent rate was pretty high, around 90%, but you can see that there was some sample loss there for the consent. And then there was, as Tom mentioned before, there was a deterministic and a probabilistic linkage step, where those who consented to the linkage were matched to their relevant administrative record. And there was some non-linkage that occurred in that step. And then not all respondents were willing to conduct a follow-up interview, and so there was some dropout there. So we're left, the NEPS sample that we analyze consists of a starting sample of 7,085. And so that was the drawn sample, and then this chart just shows you the response rates for each of the following waves of the NEPS survey. Starting with wave 1, the response rate was about 73%, and the cumulative response rate was 43% in wave 8. So the linked administrative data come from the Integrated Employment Biographies database, which is an employment database in Germany that's compiled from compulsory notifications by employers in Germany to the Federal Employment Agency. And this database contains information on employment spells, some rough measures of wages, as well as employment, I said employment spells already, but working time, whether they're working full-time, part-time, or have a mini job. Also, whether they're receiving any benefit receipts, receiving any welfare benefits, as well as participation in active labor market programs or job seeker programs, in addition to some personal characteristics. So what we wanted to know is whether adding administrative variables from this IEB dataset to the NEPS weighting scheme would result in better model fit for our response models, and ideally reduced non-response bias. So the original NEPS weighting scheme includes several variables, mainly paradata, as well as some socioeconomic variables, either from the sampling frame or information that was collected during the ALVA survey. And we enhanced this weighting scheme by adding about 16 administrative variables from the IEB data, including several substantive variables. For example, the current employment status of the person, the type of employment contract, their average daily wage, some geodata about commuting to their work location. Also, welfare benefit receipts, total number of employment and benefit spells in the last 5 years, among a few other administrative variables. And we also included some between wave information, so indicators of employment changes or indicators of changes in benefit recipient status in between the waves of the NEPs, which is something that you can only collect through administrative data as opposed to prior wave survey data. So we fit logistic regression models for 4 different outcomes for this study. First was the linkage consent and the successful linkage from the ALVA study, and panel willingness, which was also collected in the ALVA study, and then the wave-specific response in the NEPS study for each of the 8 waves. And then we use these models to construct inverse propensity weighting scores for each of these different outcomes. In our evaluation, we look at the correlations between these auxiliary variables and both the response outcome as well as the survey variables, the variables that are collected in the NEPS study, and then we evaluate the model fit using standard model fit statistics. And then for the variables where we have benchmark data for, we look at absolute bias and then differences in the survey estimates between the different weighting schemes. So looking at the results for the first research question, so this plot here shows you the absolute correlation between the different weighting variables from the administrative data set as well as the standard NEPS weighting variables. And we correlate them both with the survey variables from the NEPS study and the response outcome from each of the 8 NEPS survey waves. And so what we can see from this plot is that the correlations are generally pretty low for both the administrative and the NEPS weighting variables and the response outcome. So that's the correlations on the x-axis, which for the most part tend to be below or rarely exceed 0.1. Most correlations with the survey variables, so this is on the y-axis, are generally small as well, with some exceptions. We find that the NEPS weighting variables, education and demographic variables tend to be modestly correlated with competency measures from the NEPS study in the range of about 0.3 to 0.4. And we also found similar correlations with the IEB administrative variables, particularly for current wages and current employment status or in-between wave changes in employment status. These had moderately high correlations with the NEPS self-reported employment outcomes. Looking at some model fit statistics now, we compared the response models using only the original NEPS auxiliary variables, and then a second model adding the administrative variables to that model. What we can see here is that adding the administrative variables only slightly increases the explanatory power of these response models. These response models already have quite a low fit based on the original NEPS variables, and it only slightly improves by adding the administrative variables. And we found this both for the panel willingness model as well as the NEPS response models for each of the 8 waves. Looking more closely at each of the predictors of response in each of the 8 NEPS waves, we see that there are some significant predictors, but there's not a strong pattern, I would say. So some administrative variables are significant predictors of response in multiple waves, but not in every wave. So, for example, being employed at the time of the interview attempt is positively related to response, and in a couple of waves, and also becoming unemployed since the previous interview was negatively related to response in multiple waves as well. And sometimes, interestingly, the direction of the effect reversed, and we don't have a good explanation for that. But for example, the average daily wage was positively related to wave one response, but was negatively related to response in wave five. So we do find significant predictors, but the pattern is not always significant or consistent, I should say, across all of the waves. For the final research question, we looked at the results. The results showed that there was some large non-response biases, particularly in the later waves of the study. So these lines here show you the percentage points non-response bias for each of the 8 waves of the NEPS survey. And this is based only on the administrative variables. So we looked at non-response bias here only in the administrative variables where we had benchmark information for. And then we compared the different weighting approaches and evaluated how whether they reduce the amount of non-response bias in each of those administrative data sets, administrative variables. For each target administrative variable, we excluded that variable from the enhanced weighting procedure. So we would apply a leave one out procedure when we were developing weights for that particular administrative variable. So what we basically found was that there was very little difference between both of the weighting schemes, the standard and the enhanced. There were a few exceptions where the enhanced weighting scheme outperformed the standard scheme, particularly for the currently employed variable, the number of employment spells, and the average daily wage, where we noticed a modest amount of bias reduction in the enhanced weighting scheme relative to the standard weighting scheme. Interestingly, we also looked at the coefficient of variations, and we found that there was a small reduction in the CVs for these variables in the later waves. Lastly, we looked at the impact of these different weighting schemes on the weighted survey estimates. And so here we selected about 16 survey variables and then compared the enhanced and the standard weighting estimates for each of those 16 variables. Basically, we found no significant differences between both of these weighting procedures. It could be because there was very little bias to start with in these survey estimates, and after talking to the NEPS team, it's very similar to what they find as well. They actually find very little non-response bias in their survey variables based on their own checks. And so this could be a reason why we don't find a significant difference between the different weighting procedures. We did find evidence for the employment status variable that the enhanced weighting estimate of employment status shifts a bit closer to the corresponding administrative estimate. So this would suggest that it's reducing some of the non-response bias in that estimate. And we found that, especially for the enhanced weighting scheme, more so than the standard weighting scheme. And also we identified some reductions in the coefficient of variations for the enhanced weighting scheme, again, particularly in the later waves of the survey. So I'll wrap up now just by kind of summarizing the key findings from this case study. The goal was to evaluate whether linked administrative data could be useful in these piggyback longitudinal designs for reducing attrition bias. And we do acknowledge that these piggyback designs are a very special type of longitudinal design. But we do think it's a design that could be leveraged in terms of utilizing linked administrative data. So we found again that correlations between the administrative data and the survey variables were low to moderate, with higher correlations for construct similar variables. And we found that administrative employment variables were significant predictors of different waves of response in the NEPS study, but not always consistent across every wave. And also we found in general there was low model fit in explaining the response mechanism in each of the waves. Interestingly, we did find that becoming unemployed after the previous interview did result, it was a significant predictor of response in the subsequent wave. So that might be, you could use that information maybe to target those particular households, or maybe if they're identified before data collection starts, you might implement some kind of adaptive design and put more effort into recruiting these particular households. We found that the enhanced weighting scheme improved attrition bias for some administrative estimates. However, there were only minor effects on point estimates for substantive survey variables. The practical implications, we believe that piggyback designs with linked administrative data are worth considering, especially if the data have already been linked from the preceding survey, which was the case when we started this study. The augmented administrative or the augmented adjustment weights can potentially be useful for bias adjustment without significantly increasing the sampling variance. And we also envision that this strategy might be helpful for monitoring non-response over time, or using such a design for an adaptive data collection strategy. But of course, we also need to think about the limitations, particularly linkage failures, whether they come from non-consent or even if respondents consent, there's always a risk that their records still cannot be linked or identified. And so this poses a potential limitation. Also accounting for multiple stages of selection, which I mentioned before. There was at least 4 different stages of selection that we had to account for. And so we constructed very detailed weights that account for each of these selection stages. So that was it from my side. Thanks everyone for your attention. Happy to take questions, and I'll turn it over to Alex now.
If not, we can go to the next talk. So Pierre, right there. So
Okay.
next talk will be from Pierre from the UK Data Service, who'll talk a little bit about the data that are available for doing this kind of research.
Okay. Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for attending this presentation. My name is Pierre Walthery. I work at the training and user support wing of the UK Data Service. In case you're not familiar with the UK Data Service, we are the main provider or point of access to survey data in the UK. We have quite a lot of them. And we also have, as I suggested before, training and user support service for people who want to learn or improve their skills with survey data. So, what I want to talk to you about today is probably a little bit more pedestrian than the two presentations we've heard so far. It's really about what data is available, especially at the UK Data Service, and how to access these data. So to begin with, I had an introductory slide about the type of integrated data that there is, but I'm not going to go in depth into this because Thomas has already mentioned this. So when we look at the kind of integrated data that we have, it can either be part of the original data collection of the studies that we hold or not. It can concern or be about data that was especially collected for that purpose, or instead data that was already existing somewhere else. It can be about the unit of analysis, the main unit of analysis, the same, usually people, that is that of the survey or another one, and it can have been collected either for validation purposes, as has already been talked about a little bit earlier, or enhancement, adding content that researchers might find interesting. Administrative data, administrative records, biometric data, geographic information, or indeed social media data are the typical kind of data that is added or linked to surveys. So to be more specific, accelerometer data, which is something that measures physical activity, information about respondents' genetic makeup and how this can in fact certain outcomes, NHS records or PAYE record in relation to earnings and participation in the labor market. All of that is part of the integrated data that you can find in some of our curated data set. So as I've already said, I'm mostly going to talk about what we have, which is not all that there is in the UK. So going to my first question, what are the survey data or the survey that include integrated data? So to speak first in generic term or in general terms, so it depends on so the survey that have integrated data depends on the topic. So it's a bit basic, but whether the integrated or the data that we that is the non-survey data that is out there actually match the topics that are covered commonly in surveys. It depends on the survey itself, especially whether it has the required information for linking and user consent for that purpose was collected. The scope of the survey. So you're more likely to find in surveys with linked or survey integrated with other data if the linkage was part of the initial data collection. For all these reasons, you are more likely actually, or the mainstay of integrated data that we hold are major longitudinal studies. You have to think of these studies as really large data survey data production factories, and for that reason they have already planned for collecting extra data or linking some of the data with other sources. So when I talk about longitudinal studies, I mean the birth cohort studies, which is a British specialism, Next Steps and ELSA, which are about, on the one hand, following younger and older people, and Understanding Society, which is about household. I'll come back to this soon. And then we have a few cross-sectional studies, but these are not necessarily available with us. So the annual survey of hours and earning has been linked with some administrative data. Family resource survey, which is about, as it says, the income of families, and there are also projects to include some data, administrative data, to the Scottish Health Survey. So I am going to say a quick word about the most common of these studies for those of you who are not familiar with them. So birth cohort studies, as I say, are really British specialism. It's like most longitudinal studies about following people over time, actually over their whole life. But we are talking about people who were selected at the time of their birth. And we have currently three such studies. So one for people born in 1958, so National Child Development Study. Another one for people born in 1970, Birth Cohort Study. And the Millennium Cohort Study in 2000. I've heard that there's another one in preparation that might start in 2026. I'm not sure if there's a name for it already. Looking at the most recent data available, so the Millennium Cohort Study, so it's made of 90,000 children who were born between June 2001 and January 2003. So far, we have 7 sweep with cohort survey. We tend to talk about sweep rather than waves. So at age 3, 5, 7, and obviously 9 months, 11 and 14-year-old. So it has data about parent or coming from parent and child interview, and then it focuses on a wide area of a wide range of topics such as education, skills and health, school truancy, children cognitive ability, and so on. In addition, of course, to the traditional socioeconomic and demographic data that is collected in surveys. Understanding Society is the main household longitudinal survey. You can find it in the UK. It is representative of household as opposed to earlier a cohort of people. Initially, it was it included 40,000 households, which represented 100,000 individuals. That's gone down with attrition, but it's nonetheless, it remains really impressive. 14 waves of data between 2009 and 23, plus if we include the predecessor or the ancestor of in Understanding Society, the BHPF, which started in 91. So there's a really wide range of topic and special samples or boost samples for those who want to, for example, study ethnic minority. So as you can see, there's a really wide range of topic, which makes it maybe especially attractive to people who want to link data to study certain social dynamics. So just a very quick word about the other 2 studies I've mentioned. So Next Steps is a study that started in, I think, 2003, in which people who had just started secondary school, so age 13, 14, were interviewed. It was initially set up by the DFA to look at the determinant of school achievement. It remains there accessible to researchers. And at the other hand, we have we have the English longitudinal study of aging, which follows a cohort of people age 50 and over. And again, it's about looking on determinants of physical and mental health, financial circumstance of these people. Okay, so that's really a brief overview of the main survey data you will find linked to non-survey data. So now let's look at the other side, and let's look at the administrative record or the non-survey data that we have. As maybe has already been alluded to, administrative records are a really common type of non-survey data that is added to survey. So By administrative data, we mean data that's collected by a public authority, meaning state-controlled authority, very commonly government department, and in the UK, the NHS. Common areas of interest of the administrative data that is added to survey or linked to survey: health, of course. So in the UK, data from the National Health Service or the Scottish Health Service. So it's about medical records of people, at hospital attendance, and so on. Education is another big one. So we have the National Pupil Database in the UK, which records a wide range of information about pupils' achievement. And then information about schools, student loan data, or school inspection from Ofsted. Beyond that, there's also data that's collected by public authorities or public agencies about other topics such as pollution. So it's area-based, proximity to green space, or perhaps a little bit more commonly, information about earnings via the PAYE system. And in addition to that, you can have non-survey measurement, which probably are more commonly collected at the same time as the survey, about people's energy consumption, other health factors or behavioral factors, and also social media digital trace, but I'm not going to talk much about it. Okay, so now if we look at what's on offer in our catalog, I will just go quickly through a number of very specific kind of data that we hold and that it's attached or linked to survey. So genetic risk data, so something that's called polygenic scores. So they're about health and social outcomes linked to certain genes or genetic configuration. So they are basically the probability, so probability scores, that some outcomes might happen to someone given their genetic traits. So they, as you can imagine, they reflect really recent research. So it's still work in progress, I suppose, but they are nonetheless added to survey data. So there's a wide number of traits, so 45, that are about a wide range of outcomes such as health or behavior, mental health, personality traits, and even social outcomes. They are currently available on the main birth cohort studies, as well as ELSA and Next Step. So that's why I chose to mention it, but unfortunately it's only linked to what has been defined as genetic Europeans, whatever that means, because of the amount of data that is available on this population. Hospital episode data, that's also a very common one. So it's NHS data about everything that happens to people once they go to hospital. So there are four main data sets. So it's about episodes of usage of A&E in outpatient care, as well as admitted patient care. They are available for a significant amount of time, since 2007 or 9, depending on the data set, until 2023. And there are all sorts of diagnoses that can be looked at, and then obviously in relation to the rest of the data that's available in the surveys. Currently, it's available for mainly the NCDS, so the birth cohort with the older people born in 1958. So there's a link for more information if you're interested. Another one, school inspection data. So Ofsted. So it's the Office for Standards in Education, I think, and has a database that's called State of the Nation. It's an anonymized data set on school inspection outcome for 22,000 open schools in England, I think. And so these data have been linked with the Millennium Cohort Study that I mentioned earlier and cover years to between 2005 and 2019. And as you can imagine, that provides data on a wide range of topics, going from the quality of teaching and learning to behavior and safety on pupils, but also school leadership and management, and school level academic achievement. NEST pension data. So that's the National Employment Saving Trust, another kind of administrative data. And so the National Employment Saving Trust is the main occupational pension in the UK. So that's 1 million employer, 11 million employees. And it has been linked to consenting respondent of understanding society. The society is not shown here. Wave 11 respondents. So that's about 12,000 people. And again, it brings to understanding society more detailed information about employer and employee characteristics, pension status, pension contribution characteristics. Yeah. One last thing maybe I could mention. So in addition to really these large scale studies, we also have at the UK Data Service what is called reshare. So anyone who's collecting new data or creating some new data and that is funded or who are funded by the Economic and Social Research have to deposit these data with us. And we hold them in a special repository that's called Reshare. And sometimes there's interesting linked or integrated data in the. So I've chosen here, and you'll find the screenshot to these particular studies on the slides. A team from UCL that linked information about property characteristics to transaction and so housing transaction, basically when houses are sold, and especially the price of houses, something that was not part of the same data set until they worked on it. So that means a really large number of transactions with now information of the house they were about, so such as number of rooms, etc., etc. It's coming from the EPC reports. Okay, so that was the second part. And now quickly the third, and maybe for some of you the most important one, which is about, okay, how can I access these data? So I'll start with a quick screenshot. We are very happy at UKDS because we have a new search engine, and you can look it up here, which is much faster and hopefully will help you find integrated data more easily. So most of the time, integrated data is what we call secure. We have 3 tiers of access to the data, and that's the most stringent one. So these data, integrated data, tend to be more sensitive, have more personal information that can be disclosed or that have a higher risk of disclosure. And for that reason, it's only accessible in the Secure Lab. The Secure Lab is a way of accessing data via a VPN, so encrypted VPN, so the Citrix VPN technology. Users who are accessing secure data cannot download the dataset. They can only access it from a desktop computer that's attached or affiliated with an organization that is trusted, as well as in other locations such as the OKDA Safe Room and even abroad via partner organizations. And in addition to that, the output or the outcome of their analysis will be subject to a statistical disclosure control to make sure that no potentially disclosive information is going to be released. So that's maybe a Victorian-looking or industrial revolution-looking machinery is a way to represent the application process in order to access our secure data, going from registration, ordering the data, and maybe the most important part, becoming an approved researcher, going through receiving the login, and then going through statistical disclosure at the end. And it's a circular process because, of course, a given analysis may lead to identifying more data need and another application perhaps further down the road. So I'm going to quickly say a few more words about two core components of this application process. So the first one is safe researcher training. So irrespective of how experienced you are, if you apply for secure data, you will have to follow a safe researcher training course. And that is really about three main topics. So data security and your personal responsibility in this aspect, and including the legal information, legal background, statistical disclosure control, how to make sure that you're not inadvertently making your output or respondent identifiable. And finally, using the secure lab, so how to actually work with data in the secure lab. So once you have followed this training and you have signed the agreement, you're good to go. So the agreement is a legally binding contract between the individual user, their organization, typically a university, and the University of Essex is who's representing the UK Data Service. So it's a per person, per organization agreement. And here on the slides you see the what is included in the agreement. So, but a key point is the user needs to and confirms that they have completed the training. Okay, so now I'm just mentioning that on the slides there's a link to all the studies that I've mentioned. So feel free to have a look and maybe you find something that inspires you. And then last slide is about extra resources where you can hear more about other organizations that have been working with linked data, integrated data, including also that provide access to data that is not held at the UK Data Service. So thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any question, you're most welcome to send an email at the UK Data Service, help at UK Data Service AC UK. Thank you again.
Great. Thank you so much. Nice to see how we can get access to some of the data to do research and response. So thank you again, everyone, and take care.